All right, Scott Brinks, President and Chief Operating Officer of TransTrade. Scott has spoken to us before. I've truly enjoyed visiting and getting to know this man. He has extensive business and logistics expertise, more than 30 years in business, and he has worked in 40 different countries through logistics supply chains. He has held many functions, including strategic planning, execution operations, P&L management, business process engineering, international office establishment, expertise in both business and logistics. Please help me welcome Scott Brinks.
I have to admit that a number of things said earlier were important. Somebody said something earlier about deep survivability. Well, I'll apologize for the voice, because this is the voice that the Lord left me with after I deeply survived a stage 4 cancer. So that was one thing. I've been hearing about one of my favorite things all morning, which is, though the term hasn't been used, Mr. Schumpeter's creative destruction, which is a part of all the things that we do. I wanted to talk today about supply chain and the trends that are coming, and I think it ties. I can't believe how well the table was set by everyone earlier to walk through this process. What are the drivers that we have all talked about throughout the day and will continue to talk about as we go forward? We have high cost infrastructures in large plants, labor costs. We do things in high volume. We have big transport costs. We drive around the world to try to find lower cost environments in the way we move forward. And we rely unbelievably on supply chain. And I'm going to show you in a minute why that reliance doesn't make sense. It's clearly not sustainable, and it's the wrong direction to go. We don't build big anymore, for lots of reasons. Environmental impacts. This is the Min River in China. They're about to build a series of dams. For those of you who know the Sierra Nevada, that's the dam at Hetch Hetchy, which they're talking about trying to take down. This is Three Gorges. And who can tell me what that building is? Where? In Pyongyang. That thing's been empty since 1985 because they've never finished it. They just got the glass up on it in the last 5 years, but there's nothing in it. So we have huge impacts for trying to build big things, which we don't do anymore. We mentioned earlier about how our electric system and grid, and when it goes down, it takes down thousands, and it's out for long periods of time. We regulate that. Of course, NIMBY is a big deal for a lot of us in this country, but around it is we also have limited capital now. You know, I don't know how many times Ken talked about debt. Well, it's a big deal. So we don't have the capital, and we don't have the risk tolerance to build big anymore. Part of that is that the supply chain is not sustainable. You know, we outsource and offshore, and it's all been based on a false premise, and that was cheap fuel. At $4 a gallon, fuel exceeds labor in domestic transportation. Think about that for a minute. In trucking across the United States, fuel has overcome labor costs. Okay, unsustainable. False confidence. There's a huge amount of risk in global supply chain. There's hundreds and hundreds of complex things that can happen that delay shipments, that break down processes, that don't allow you to clear customs, go through regulatory formalities in different locations. We've believed in false outcomes. I mentioned this a couple of years ago here, and Doc Hall picked up on it, and some others did. I made the statement that we could cut the amount of trucks in the United States in half tomorrow. And we could. And it's because we ship 50% air. When was the last time you got a box from Amazon that didn't have an airbag in it? When was the last time you bought a thumb drive that didn't have a big piece of paper attached to it? Go to your nearest pharmacy. Buy a 50-count bottle of Bayer aspirin. Buy a 100-count bottle of Bayer aspirin. Go home, dump out the 50, pour the 100 into the 50. It fits. We're shipping air. Okay? That's not sustainable. The false promise we had years ago, how many years have they talked about mass customization? Doesn't work. Why? Because we have expensive infrastructures. We produce in high volumes in order to get the lowest cost per unit. But the world, folks, is about to change. We're going back to the future. I've talked before about distributed manufacturing and back to things like the corner grocery store. Okay? The electric grid going down. We'll have turbines, natural gas turbines, that'll start being installed in your neighborhood. And we'll produce power, we'll produce other things needed in processes that are small, that are community-based. We've talked a couple times about community, how we get more related to each other. It's going to be community-based. This one on the lower right is an interesting one. This is an experimental lab for the military, United States Army. It comes in a 20-foot container. I'll show a picture of it later. Inside it, it has two things in it. It has a machining piece of equipment, and it has a 3D printer. And they put it out near the battlefield, and it makes parts on the spot. Today, that's done. 3 guys, it's got set with satellite. It can reach into any design of any part in any military weapon system. And it can be made in the field today. So where are we going? Distributed manufacturing, getting manufacturing in small ways back into the community, back to the future, okay? We have been for years moving physical goods, and it was driven by materials and labor costs. We're getting now to where we're going to be moving electrons instead of physical goods. We can create physical goods in local situations. If I have a warehouse that has 10 or 12 varying 3D printers or additive manufacturing systems set up, I can build anything needed within 100 miles nearly. In 10 or 15 years, that's where we'll be. Additive manufacturing. So instead of moving physical goods and materials, again, I'm going to be moving electrons, and it'll be software driven. So suddenly, the realization of mass customization happens. Because instead of mass, it's mass customization at the single unit level. Single unit level. I don't have to retool a machine. I can build an individual item for a single demand and move it and go on to the next that could be in a completely different environment. Okay? We're doing this today in metals. Last week I read about a titanium jaw that was made for a lady in Germany in a 3D printing machine, installed in a surgery, successful. And it was made 3 blocks from the hospital. That's coming. Postponement. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the logistics term of postponement. Okay? Postponement means that I'm going to do the final configuration of a product as close to the customers and the end customer as possible. So if all of you have a phone, when you look at that phone, instead of that phone being made in its final configuration in China, it can be brought here, and then when you order a red one, I can put the red cover on just as you buy it. that's postponement. But this is postponement down through the actual manufacture of the goods. That's what additive manufacturing brings to us. So, and they're doing it in metals. Do it in Kevlar, do it in titanium. So what happens here? This is about exchanging value. The value we used to have in large infrastructures, in long supply chains, in detail, and in massive amounts of capital. Okay, we talked about money before, but it's an important thing to understand capital. Not just, it's human capital, it's social capital, it's economic capital. So think about for a minute, if a manufacturing facility is in your community, we're going to change values here. We're going to go from the ability to have a big factory to the ability to own the design. Because anybody can build it with a 3D printer. Okay? We're going to go from, again, the infrastructure of a factory to moving electrons. It's happening now. Okay? High volume to single unit. Modular customization, unit item customization. And when you have a set of machines, say a warehouse full of 15 or 20 of these machines that have different input commodities in them, then your ability to create any kind of output is unlimited. I'm not defined by, I only have machines to make a shirt, or the modules to make this microphone. I can make any and all of them, and the changeover is next to nothing. That's the beauty of all this. So we're starting to think about how we get sustainable, because we don't need significant infrastructure. We need lots of little ones. Okay, it's back to the future. The community manufacturing center. Here's this container. When they open it up, they put it out front. And think about for a minute, on demand and on design. The value is going to switch from the guy that has the infrastructure to the lady that has the design capability. Because we're going to commoditize the manufacturing. Okay? Reduces the waste. Now, the one that you think of here is the commodity inputs. It maximizes the ton-mile density. For me to get powdered metals moved, it's significantly dense. I move much less air. That moves over to the manufacturing facility. Then really the only transport I need is the final mile. It's to get it from the manufacturer to the person in the community who needs that item. Now, we're a ways from this, but it's heading that direction. And the fact that it's distributed can happen everywhere. And it's small, so it's easy to work with. So what's the real driver of all this? You know, we were talking about earlier about money. I believe that there's one singular purpose for logistics and supply chain. I think there's one singular purpose for a lot of the things we do, and that is the velocity of capital, whether that's human capital or not. What we need to be thinking about is changing the velocity of how things are done. Moving electrons instead of physical goods. Moving capital. And what's going to drive this is the velocity of capital. We've talked about finance earlier. The purpose of logistics is to accelerate capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So I'm going to jump in with the first comment, and then we'll hand out the mics. But I want to go back to additive manufacturing and the trend, which is quite significant. But I, again, want to put it in context. So if we look at the domain of all things that get consumed, again, we can put food, and let's just call it liquids, and then we have special stuff, and automotive and aero. Somewhere on this is a domain, and how wide this is, we don't really know, where there's a scope of things that fall within what can be done with additive manufacturing today. What we're seeing, and the real trend here, is what can be done and what will be able to be done is growing incredibly rapidly. And it's this growth across the larger context that will have a bigger and bigger impact, and the combination of that and localization. But I really think that we need to, again, go back to, for all of the trends and drivers that we're discussing, to think about the context and the larger context within them to understand how they apply. And when we come back to decisions, I want to go back to the trends and drivers and then back to the context again. So
the growth that you mentioned there is happening exponentially today, and the amount of things that can be built in additive manufacturing. And I don't think the car factory will ever go away for a long time, but the parts replacement will, kind of a thing.
About 3 minutes for questions.
Back to context then for a minute. It turns out that as this evolves, it completely destroys the foundation for ad valorem taxation. Governments will no longer have an income. Secondly, next year, you'll be able to print your own .45 caliber firearm on your dining room table without a background check.
I think what you describe here has a particular application that is for parts that you can carve out a single block of material. Yeah, and so even this firearm, I don't think you will ever get it out of the printer. It takes some highly specialized processing steps to get from a piece of metal to a firearm. I mean, there's all kinds of steps there. So I think that the validity of what you describe here is for a very, very small part that's probably insignificant, will have insignificant impact on the amount of global transportation that we need.
I will vehemently disagree with you, because this is going to change. This is already changing the world. Most of you just haven't seen it yet. My industry is fundamentally changing, and it will change very quickly, because watching them build parts in metal already from powders is going to make this change.
One more. I'm sorry. One more. Here, please.
I ended up with the mic, so I guess I get to ask the question. As I heard the last several talks, I found myself thinking about some sayings from Bill Hewlett, Napoleon Bonaparte, and one of mine. A mentor of mine once told me, Bill Hewlett said, "Show me a man's performance metric and I'll show you where he spends his time." And Napoleon remarked on how amazing it is what you can get generals to do for merely a bit of ribbon. And so I found myself wondering, this is a two-part question. I found myself wondering whether the social changes underlying the directions that all these talks have been going in are going to succeed or founder based on whether we can find performance metrics and reward structures that go with them. And that consequently leads to a saying of mine, which is that most people think the fundamental drivers of human behavior are safety, food, and reproduction. I disagree. I think the fundamental drivers are to make rules and to find ways around them. And so I find myself thinking as we look at these systems and think about those reward structures, what opportunities do those changes open up to game the system and break the system? So, for example, if we're going to move towards design over manufacturing, that critically depends on whether we can protect the intellectual property of design or find some reward other than recompense for doing it and sharing it.
Thank you, Bob. Those are really wonderful, wonderful comments. You want to go to Peter real quickly?
So hopefully two quick things. One, sort of echoing your point. I did a bit years ago on what I called respectful capitalism. And the idea is that if you look at how people are motivated, there's both money and respect. And that we've sort of gone to this idea of money is everything. Yet if you think about the most efficient kind of a system, people get paid in respect. You go to the internet, sometimes it's a click for a penny, but a lot of times it's people just doing it for the respect. So anyhow, that's just one thought. It's interesting to me that there's this we've had at least two speakers who would probably be branded as Marxists 20 years ago. So there's that undercurrent. Then with respect to manufacturing, I'm kind of with the limited role for rapid prototyping until we get even better material properties, and would suggest that for things like iPods, the existing supply chain works pretty well, and who cares if you throw it away in 5 years. There's this certainly a realm of everything at OXO good grips can be better made with rapid prototyping. But there's also a arena that we've sort of messed up, which is things like appliances. So if you look at the average dehumidifier or coffee grinder or coffee pot, many of us had one that lasted for 20 years and we dearly loved, and we're still going to want coffee and dry air 20 years from now. Those things are now being made in a process that leaves you with a device that lasts 1 or 2 years. And so turning back the clock on that might be something else that would save energy over the long term.